The mountain man had 16 hours until sunrise. 16 hours at minus 71 degrees Celsius, in a place where exposed skin froze in under 5 minutes, where breath crystallized before it left your mouth, where simply staying alive required continuous, perfect execution. He stood at the northwestern edge of Oymyakon as the January sun touched the horizon, painting the frozen basin in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful if they didn't signal the approach of the coldest night of the year. The thermometer mounted on a nearby post read minus 68.4. In 3 hours, it would drop past minus 70. By midnight, minus 71. And it would stay there, hovering at that lethal threshold, until the sun returned sometime after 10 in the morning. He'd come here with a challenge in mind, the kind that separated campfire stories from lived experience. One night, alone, outside, no heated shelter, no village hospitality, just him and the kind of cold that existed at the absolute edge of human survivability. Most people would call it suicide. The locals he'd spoken to had called it foolish. But the mountain man, 47 years old, 2 decades of winter experience in Alaska, the Yukon, and northern Canada, called it necessary. Deep down, he'd always wanted to be the kind of man the old-time trappers would nod at with respect, the kind who understood cold not as an enemy to be avoided, but as a force to be respected and survived. He wanted to know if the stories he'd told himself about his capabilities were true, or just comfortable lies kept alive by never being properly tested. Now he'd find out. He'd brought 7 items with him, carried in a worn canvas pack that had seen him through a dozen winters. 7 tools that wouldn't keep him alive by themselves, but would help him make better use of what the frozen landscape had to offer. First, a ferro rod, his primary fire-starting method. Matches and lighters failed at these temperatures, the fuel freezing or refusing to ignite. But a ferro rod would throw sparks regardless of cold, assuming his hands remained functional enough to strike it. Second, a hatchet, not for self-defense or hunting, but for processing the firewood that would mean the difference between survival and freezing to death. Every piece of fuel would need to be split small enough to burn hot and fast. Third, a fixed-blade knife, for cutting, carving, processing, the universal tool that solved 100 small problems before they became fatal ones. Fourth, an aluminum pot, light enough to carry, durable enough to survive rough handling, and essential for melting snow into drinkable water. Eating snow directly would lower his core temperature. Hot water, even without tea or coffee, would help maintain the internal heat his body desperately needed. Fifth, a reindeer for a sleeping roll, the one concession to comfort, though calling it comfortable would be generous. It was heavy, bulky, and smelled of smoke and animal, but reindeer fur had evolved to survive Arctic winters. The hollow hairs trapped air and provided insulation that synthetic materials couldn't match. Sixth, an expedition-grade face mask made from neoprene and fur. His entire face would need to be covered except for a narrow slit for his eyes. Exposed facial skin would develop frostbite in minutes at minus 71. And seventh, chemical hand warmers, small packets that generated heat through oxidation. They wouldn't keep his hands warm indefinitely, but they might save his fingers during critical moments when dexterity meant the difference between success and failure. He dressed in layers that added nearly 15 kilograms to his frame. Wool base layers, fleece mid-layers, a down jacket, and finally a hooded parka rated to minus 60. Wool pants, insulated snow pants, and windproof outer pants. Boots rated to minus 70 with wool liners and vapor barriers. 3 layers of gloves. 2 hats under his parka hood. It was 4:47 p.m. The sun would set by 5:15. He had perhaps 30 minutes of useful twilight after that before complete darkness claimed the village. He needed to move. The location he'd chosen was a kilometer from the village center, far enough that he couldn't simply walk to a heated building if things went wrong, but close enough that someone might find him in the morning if he failed to return. It was an abandoned hunting shelter, barely more than 3 walls, and a partial roof made from scrap wood and salvaged materials. The structure provided minimal wind protection, but no insulation and no heat. That was intentional. A heated building would defeat the purpose. He needed to survive using only what he could create and maintain himself. The walk took 15 careful minutes, pulling a small sled loaded with firewood he'd prepared earlier in the day. Moving quickly enough to maintain body heat, but slowly enough to avoid sweating. Sweat at -68 was a death sentence. Moisture would freeze against his skin, creating ice layers that would draw heat away from his core faster than his body could generate it. He reached the shelter as the sun kissed the horizon. The structure was exactly as he'd found it that morning during his scouting trip. 3 plywood walls arranged in a U-shape, a roof of corrugated metal over 2/3 of the space, and packed snow forming the floor. No door, just an opening facing east, away from the prevailing wind direction. It was crude, barely adequate, and it would have to be enough. The mountain man worked with focused intensity. First, he cleared a fire pit area just outside the shelter opening, positioning it where smoke would vent away, but heat would radiate into the enclosed space. The ground was frozen solid, permafrost extending hundreds of meters down, so he couldn't dig. Instead, he built up, creating a fire platform using flat rocks he'd gathered earlier. The firewood came next. He'd brought approximately 40 kilograms of split wood, birch and larch, both good burning woods that would provide sustained heat. Under normal winter conditions, 40 kilograms would last him several days. Tonight, at -71, he estimated it might last until 2 or 3 a.m., maybe 4 a.m. if he was conservative and lucky. That meant at some point during the night, probably during the coldest hours, he'd have to venture out to gather more fuel. The thought was not comforting. He stacked the wood carefully, keeping the driest pieces for fire starting, arranging the rest for easy access even in complete darkness. Organization now would save precious seconds later when his hands were numb and his mind was sluggish from cold and exhaustion. The sun touched the horizon at 5:14 p.m. The temperature had dropped to -69.1. Fire. Everything depended on fire. The mountain man gathered his tinder, birch bark he'd processed into fine shavings, dead grass he'd found under the snow that morning, and a small amount of cotton cloth pulled into loose fibers. He arranged it in a careful nest, protected from any wind by his body and the shelter walls. He struck the ferro rod. Sparks cascaded into the tinder, and for a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. Then a tiny ember glowed orange. He bent close, cupped his hands around it, and blew gently. The ember brightened. Smoke appeared. He added more tinder, coaxing the ember into a flame. Fire. The small flame caught on the birch bark, and he carefully added twigs, then small branches, then larger pieces. Within 5 minutes, he had a legitimate fire burning, not large, but steady and hot. The relief was physical, almost overwhelming. Fire meant survival was possible. Without it, he'd have lasted maybe 3 or 4 hours before hypothermia made continuing pointless. As darkness descended completely by 5:45 p.m., the mountain man settled into his routine. He positioned a reindeer for a sleeping role inside the shelter, oriented so he could tend the fire without fully exposing himself to the cold. He filled his aluminum pot with clean snow and positioned it near the fire to melt. The thermometer he'd mounted on the shelter wall read -69.8 at 6 p.m., -70.3 at 6:30 p.m., -70.7 at 7 p.m. The cold was intensifying, settling into the basin like a living thing. He could hear it, the sharp crack of wood contracting, the crystalline crunch of snow hardening, even the subtle change in how sound carried through air that was becoming denser and more hostile with each passing minute. His first hot water was ready by 7:15 p.m. He drank it slowly, feeling the warmth spread from his stomach outward. It wasn't coffee or tea. He deliberately brought nothing with caffeine, knowing he'd need to rest during the long night even if true sleep would be impossible. But the hot water was life itself, calories and warmth delivered directly to his core. He ate his first meal, dried meat and some nuts, foods that provided maximum calories with minimum preparation. Cooking anything elaborate would waste fuel and time. Tonight was about efficiency, about reducing every action to its essential components. By 8 p.m., thermometer read -71.1. The peak had arrived. The mountain man fed his fire with careful precision, adding wood piece by piece, maintaining heat without wasting fuel. He knew the mathematics intimately. Too much would create excess heat that radiated into the sky and was lost. Too little, and the fire would die, and restarting it with numb hands in -71-degree darkness might be impossible. The cold pressed against his shelter from all sides. Even with the fire, even with his many layers, he could feel it probing for weaknesses. His face, protected by the neoprene mask, still stung where tiny gaps allowed cold air to touch skin. His feet, despite the rated boots, were beginning to feel distant and numb. His fingers worked, but slower than normal, each movement requiring conscious thought. This was the reality of -71, not the dramatic freeze-in seconds of Hollywood movies, but slow, relentless assault that never paused, never forgave mistakes, and never gave back what it took. He checked his firewood supply at 8:30 p.m. He'd already burned through more than he'd planned. The extreme cold was consuming fuel faster than his calculations had predicted. At this rate, his supply would last until 1 a.m., maybe 1:30 if he rationed severely. That meant 6.5 hours from now, in the coldest, darkest part of the night. He'd have to leave his shelter and venture into the frozen landscape to gather more wood. The thought sat in his mind like a stone. But that was a problem for 1 a.m. Right now, at 8:30 p.m., his job was simpler. Tend the fire, maintain core temperature, stay alert, and survive the next hour. Then the hour after that. Then the hour after that. 16 hours until sunrise. He completed 2. 14 to go. The mountain man wrapped his reindeer fur more tightly around his shoulders, fed another piece of wood to the fire, and watched the flames dance against the absolute darkness of an Oymyakon night. Deep down, he'd always wanted to be the kind of man who could survive anything, the kind the old trappers would respect. But sitting here as the thermometer held steady at -71.1, as his fuel supply dwindled faster than planned, as the cold found new gaps in his defenses, he wondered if wanting it badly enough would be sufficient. The night stretched ahead, dark and cold and merciless. He was about to find out if the stories he'd told himself were true. By 9:30 p.m., the mountain man had fallen into a rhythm that felt almost sustainable. Feed the fire every 12 minutes. Check extremities for numbness every 15. Melt snow and drink hot water every 30 minutes. Rotate position every 20 minutes to ensure even heat exposure. It was mechanical, repetitive, but the routine kept him alive and kept his mind occupied. The thermometer held steady at -71.2. The cold had reached its peak and settled there, patient and absolute. He'd eaten twice more, small portions of dried meat and some chocolate he'd brought for quick energy. The chocolate was frozen solid, requiring him to shave thin pieces with his knife and let them melt slowly in his mouth. Biting into it directly would have cracked a tooth. Everything at this temperature became harder, more brittle, more hostile to normal human interaction. His fire was burning well, a steady orange glow that pushed back the darkness in a small circle around his shelter. Beyond that circle, the world was utterly black. No moon tonight, no village lights visible from this distance. Just darkness and cold and the occasional distant sound. Wood cracking somewhere, or perhaps ice shifting, or maybe just his imagination filling the void. At 10:15 p.m., he noticed the first concerning sign. The fire, which had been burning consistently, seemed to be producing less heat despite consuming the same amount of wood. He checked the wood itself, dry, good quality. No different from what he'd been burning all evening. The problem, he realized, was atmospheric. At -71, even fire struggled. The extreme cold was affecting combustion efficiency, pulling heat away almost as fast as the flames could generate it. This was something he hadn't fully accounted for. His fuel calculations had been based on normal winter conditions, -30, -40. But -71 wasn't just colder. It was exponentially more demanding, consuming resources at rates that defied his experience. He did the math again in his head, counting the remaining pieces of wood. 18 good-sized pieces left. At current consumption, roughly one piece every 12 minutes. That gave him 3 hours and 36 minutes. It was 10:15 now. His fuel would run out at approximately 1:51 a.m. 7 hours until first light. The deficit was undeniable. At 11 p.m., he made his decision. He couldn't wait until the wood was completely exhausted. Going out at 1:51 a.m. with no fire to return to would be suicide. He needed to gather more fuel now, while his fire was still strong, while he still had heat to come back to. The mountain man stood slowly, his joints stiff from sitting in the cold despite the fire. He pulled his outer layers tighter, checked that his face mask was secure, and activated 2 chemical hand warmers, placing one in each glove. These would give him perhaps 20 minutes of enhanced dexterity. After that, his hands would be on their own. He grabbed a small flashlight, tested and working, but he knew it wouldn't last long in this cold, and a canvas sack for carrying wood. The plan was simple. Walk 50 meters into the forest edge where he'd seen down branches that morning, gather as much as he could carry, and return. Total time outside, 15 minutes maximum. At -71, 15 minutes was pushing the limit of safe exposure even with proper gear. He stepped beyond the protective radius of his fire at 11:07 p.m. The cold was instantaneous and total. Within 3 steps, he could feel it penetrating his layers, finding microscopic gaps in his clothing, drawing heat from his body with greedy efficiency. His breath formed clouds of ice crystals that hung in the beam of his flashlight. Each inhalation burned his throat despite breathing through his scarf. His eyes began watering, and those tears froze on his eyelashes, partially obscuring his vision. He moved toward the tree line, each step deliberate. The snow crunched under his boots with that particular sound that only happened at extreme temperatures, sharp, brittle, like walking on shattered glass. His flashlight beam seemed weaker, the batteries draining faster than they should. 50 meters felt like 50 kilometers. He reached the first downed tree and began gathering branches, working quickly but not frantically. Panic would make him sloppy, and sloppy at -71 meant frostbite or worse. He broke branches over his knee, the wood snapping cleanly in the extreme cold, and loaded them into his sack. His fingers were already going numb despite the chemical warmers. The warmers were helping, but they couldn't overcome -71 indefinitely. He had maybe 10 more minutes of useful hand function. He gathered branch after branch, filling his sack until it was heavy but manageable. Enough for perhaps 3 more hours of burning. It would have to do. His face was going numb now, the exposed skin around his eyes stinging and then losing sensation. That was stage 1 frostbite beginning. Not catastrophic yet, but a warning. He turned to head back and realized with a spike of adrenaline that his fire wasn't visible. Had he walked further than 50 meters? Had he gotten turned around in the darkness? For a moment, just a moment, panic clawed at his chest. Then he saw it. A faint orange glow through the trees, barely visible but there. He just walked slightly off angle. The fire was maybe 60 meters away, not 50. Those extra 10 meters felt significant at -71. He walked back, pulling the heavy sack, his breath coming harder now. The exertion was warming him, but that warmth came with a terrible price, sweat. He could feel moisture forming under his base layers, and he knew that sweat would freeze once he stopped moving. He'd have to get back to the fire and dry out immediately. The walk back took 7 minutes that felt like an hour. By the time he stumbled into the firelight at 11:24 p.m., his face was completely numb, his fingers barely functional, and frost had formed on the front of his parka where his breath had crystallized. He dropped the sack and collapsed next to the fire, closer than was entirely safe, desperate for heat. He pulled off his outer gloves with clumsy movements and held his hands near the flames, not in them, which would cause burns, but close enough to feel warmth penetrating the numbness. The pain came 5 minutes later as circulation returned. His fingers throbbed with a deep, stabbing ache that made him grit his teeth. His face burned as the frozen tissue warmed. These were good signs. Pain meant tissue damage wasn't permanent, meant blood flow was returning, meant he'd survived this exposure. But the cost was clear. He'd been outside for 17 minutes, and it had extracted a physical toll that would take an hour to fully recover from, and he'd gained only 3 hours worth of fuel. By 1:51 a.m., he'd have to do it again. At midnight, the mountain man checked his status. The new wood was stacked and drying near the fire. His face had recovered from the frostbite, showing only red patches where tissue had frozen. His fingers were functional again, though they ached. His core temperature felt stable, but he was tired, not sleepy. The cold prevented true sleep, but exhausted in a way that went deeper than physical fatigue. The constant vigilance, the continuous small decisions, the unrelenting demand to stay alert and functional, it was wearing him down in ways he hadn't fully anticipated. The thermometer still read -71.2. The cold hadn't eased at all. He was 4.5 hours into his 16-hour challenge, and the worst hours were still ahead. The coldest time in Oymyakon was between 3 o'clock and 5 a.m., when even the minimal residual heat from the previous day had fully dissipated. He fed the fire and did the math again. Current wood supply would last until approximately 3:15 a.m. After that, he'd need to make another wood-gathering run. In the coldest, darkest hours of the night, the thought sat heavy in his mind. At 12:30 a.m., something changed. He noticed it first as a shift in the fire's behavior. Flames that had been burning steadily began to flicker and dance. Then he felt it wind. Just a light breeze at first, barely noticeable. But within 10 minutes, it had strengthened to a steady flow of air moving through the basin. The wind wasn't strong, maybe 15 kilometers per hour, but at -71, even gentle wind transformed conditions from brutal to deadly. Wind chill was now pushing the effective temperature past -80°C. Exposed skin would freeze in under 3 minutes. His fire, which had been reliably warming his shelter, was now being disrupted by the moving air. Flames pushed and scattered. Heat dissipated before it could accumulate. And worse, the wind was consuming his fuel faster than ever. Wood that should have lasted 12 minutes was burning completely in 8 or 9. The increased oxygen flow and the heat dispersion making his supply vanish at an accelerated rate. He recalculated grimly. With the wind, his current supply would last until maybe 2:30 a.m., and his next wood-gathering trip, already dangerous, had just become significantly more so. At 1 a.m., he ate again, forcing down dried meat even though he wasn't particularly hungry. Calories were survival fuel, and he needed every advantage. He drank more hot water, melted from snow that he now had to shield from the wind to keep it from blowing away before it could melt. His shelter, which had been adequate when the air was still, was now less effective. The wind found every gap in the plywood walls, every opening in the partial roof, creating drafts that pulled heat away. He repositioned his sleeping roll to the most protected corner and wrapped himself more tightly in the reindeer fur. But even that wasn't enough. He could feel his core temperature dropping slightly, not dangerously yet, but trending in the wrong direction. He needed to generate more heat, which meant burning more wood, which meant running out faster. The mathematics of survival were turning against him. At 1:45 a.m., He stood and prepared for his second wood-gathering expedition. The wind was steady now, and stepping beyond his fire's protection would mean facing not just -71, but wind chill equivalent to -83 or -85. This was the threshold where survival guides simply said, "Do not go outside." But he had no choice. Without fuel, his fire would die by 2:30 a.m. Without fire, he would die by 4 a.m. The calculation was brutally simple. He activated his last 2 chemical hand warmers, pulled his face mask as tight as it would go, and picked up his canvas sack and flashlight. The flashlight was noticeably dimmer now, the batteries struggling in the extreme cold. He had maybe 10 minutes of usable light. At 1:51 a.m., the mountain man stepped away from his fire and into the wind-driven darkness. The cold hit him like a physical blow, so intense it momentarily took his breath away. The wind drove the temperature through every layer he wore, finding vulnerabilities he didn't know existed. His eyes watered instantly, and those tears froze before they could fall, creating ice on his cheeks beneath his mask. He walked toward the tree line, each step an act of will, his body screaming at him to turn back to the fire. But the fire would die without fuel. There was no turning back. The darkness was total, his failing flashlight creating only a weak bubble of visibility. The wind howled through the trees with a sound like voices, like warnings, like the mountain itself, telling him he'd pushed too far. But he pushed on, into the cold and darkness and wind, because stopping meant dying, and he wasn't ready to die. Not tonight. Not here. 2:17 in the morning. The mountain man sat by a fire that had become his entire universe, feeding it with a piece of wood every 6 minutes, a rhythm he'd established through painful trial and error over the past hour. Any longer between additions, and the flames weakened dangerously. Any more frequent, and he burned through his fuel too quickly. 6 minutes. Watch the flames. Add wood. 6 minutes. Watch the flames. Add wood. The monotony was hypnotic, almost trance-like, and he had to fight against the strange comfort it offered. Comfort at -71 was dangerous. Comfort meant letting your guard down, meant missing the signs of frostbite creeping deeper, meant falling into a sleep you might not wake from. His second fuel run had been even worse than the first. The village woodpile was further than he'd remembered, or perhaps his sense of distance had been distorted by exhaustion and cold. He'd made 3 trips, each one feeling like it might be the trip that claimed his fingers or toes permanently. The chemical hand warmers had stopped working at 1:45 a.m., their oxidation reaction finally exhausted, and his hands were now purely dependent on wool and leather and whatever heat he could generate through movement. But he had fuel now, maybe enough to last until dawn. Maybe. The thermometer read -71.3. Somehow, impossibly, it had gotten colder. The cold had found a new depth, a new level of hostility that seemed almost personal. At 2:30 a.m., the mountain man noticed his left foot had gone completely numb. Not the tingling numbness of reduced circulation, but the absolute absence of sensation that signaled genuine danger. He removed his outer boot with fumbling hands, a process that took nearly 5 minutes, and checked the inner boot and liner. Ice. Ice had formed between the vapor barrier and the wool liner, moisture from his foot condensing and freezing despite all the layers, designed to prevent exactly that. The ice was drawing heat away from his foot faster than his body could replace it. He had to make a decision. Leave the boot configuration as it was and risk permanent frostbite damage to his foot, or try to dry everything out by the fire and risk the leather freezing solid while exposed. There was no good option. Only the option that might work versus the option that definitely wouldn't. He positioned the boot components near the fire. Not too close, or the leather would cook and become brittle, but close enough to drive out the moisture. Then he wrapped his wool-clad foot in a section of his reindeer fur sleeping roll and tucked it against his body. 15 minutes. That's how long he'd give the boots to dry. Any longer, and he'd be unable to put them back on if they froze solid. While he waited, He melted more snow for water. The aluminum pot was coated with soot now, blackened by hours of exposure to open flame, but it still functioned. Hot water was currency tonight. Each cup was warmth delivered directly to his core, was calories not needed for shivering, was a few more minutes of survival. He drank slowly, feeling the liquid warmth spread through his chest and stomach. His body was burning calories at a terrifying rate, fighting to maintain 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit in an environment that was 169 degrees colder. The dried meat and nuts he'd brought were helping, but they weren't enough. By dawn, his body would be running on fumes, having burned through fat reserves and begun breaking down muscle for fuel. The fire crackled, sending sparks upward into the darkness, where they died almost instantly in the frozen air. Each spark was a tiny defeat, heat escaping into the void, never to return. At 2:47 a.m., he reassembled his boot configuration and forced his foot back into it. The leather was stiff but manageable, and critically, the ice was gone. His foot tingled painfully as circulation returned, a good sign, ironically, since pain meant the nerves still functioned. By 3 a.m., a new problem emerged. The mountain man was struggling to stay alert. The combination of physical exhaustion, caloric deficit, and hours of monotonous fire tending was creating a dangerous fog in his mind. His eyes would close for just a second, then snap open as his body jerked awake. Microsleeps, each one a warning that his brain was trying to shut down despite the lethal circumstances. He stood up, forcing movement, doing squats and arm swings inside the limited space of the shelter. The movement generated heat and, more importantly, kept him conscious. But it also burned calories he couldn't spare and created sweat that would freeze if he didn't manage it carefully. The balance was impossible. Everything was impossible. Yet he was still here, still breathing, still feeding the fire. At 3:30 a.m., he experienced something he'd only read about in extreme survival accounts, a moment of complete dissociation where his mind seemed to separate from his body. He watched himself from outside, saw a figure huddled by a small fire in an inadequate shelter at the edge of the coldest village on Earth, and thought clinically, "That man is going to die here." Then his perspective snapped back into his body, and he was the man by the fire again, and dying was not acceptable. He fed the fire. 6 minutes later, he fed it again. The thermometer read -71.1 at 4 a.m. The cold was holding steady, maintaining its grip, refusing to release even as the night aged toward morning. This was the heart of it, the deepest part of the ordeal. These hours between 3 and 5 in the morning, when human physiology was at its weakest, when circadian rhythms signaled that sleep should come, when the body's core temperature naturally dropped, these were the hours that killed people. The mountain man had read accounts of experienced mountaineers dying in their sleep at high-altitude camps, their bodies simply giving up during these pre-dawn hours. He'd read about trappers found frozen in their shelters, their fires gone cold, their bodies positioned as if sleeping peacefully. The body wanted to shut down during these hours. It wanted rest that cold made fatal. He forced himself to his feet again, moving, refusing to let stillness claim him. At 4:30 a.m., he noticed the quality of darkness beginning to change. Not light. It was far too early for actual sunrise, but a subtle shift from absolute black to the faintest suggestion of deep blue at the eastern horizon. Pre-dawn astronomical twilight, the first hint that Earth was rotating him back toward the sun. The knowledge provided a psychological boost that was almost physical. Dawn was coming. Not soon. Still 4 or 5 hours before the sun would actually clear the horizon, but coming nonetheless. The coldest hours were passing. He'd made it through the worst. Or so he thought. At 4:47 a.m., his fire began acting strangely. The flames, which had been steady and predictable, started flickering erratically. Smoke that should have risen straight up began swirling in unpredictable patterns. Wind. The mountain man felt it a moment later, A subtle shift in air pressure, a whisper of movement that hadn't been there before. Wind was arriving in the basin, breaking up the stagnant cold air mass. Under normal circumstances, wind would be welcome. It would mix warmer air from above with the coldest surface layer, potentially raising the temperature by several degrees. But right now, at 4:47 a.m. with minus 71-degree air, wind was a new threat. Wind would drive cold through every gap in his shelter. Wind would steal heat from his fire, making it less efficient. Wind would make his remaining fuel burn faster. Wind would find the microscopic spaces in his clothing layers and penetrate to his skin. He repositioned himself, using his body to shelter the fire from the growing breeze. He pulled his sleeping roll tighter around his shoulders. He fed the fire more frequently, trying to build up a larger flame that could resist the wind's assault. By 5:15 a.m., the wind had strengthened to a steady flow, maybe 5 or 6 miles per hour. Nothing dramatic, but enough to transform conditions. The fire's heat, which had been radiating into his shelter, was now being pulled away and dispersed. The temperature inside his protected space dropped noticeably. His firewood supply, which he'd thought might last until dawn, was being consumed faster than ever. He'd been rationing so carefully, calculating so precisely, but the wind had changed all the mathematics. At the current burn rate, he'd run out of fuel by 6:30 a.m., still 3 or 4 hours before sunrise, still deep in dangerous cold. The mountain man stared at his dwindling wood pile and made a decision. He could ration even more severely, let the fire die down to barely adequate levels and risk hypothermia. Or he could maintain the fire properly and accept that he'd need to make one more fuel run in the darkness, one more trip to the village woodpile, one more exposure to minus 71 degrees with wind, one more gamble that his body could endure what he was asking of it. At 5:45 a.m., with the faintest suggestion of twilight beginning to stain the eastern sky, he prepared for his third and final fuel run of the night. Every part of his body protested. His legs were stiff and clumsy. His hands, even inside 3 layers of gloves, felt like wooden clubs. His face, behind a neoprene mask, was a map of frozen and refrozen tissue. His feet were numb blocks that responded to his brain's commands a full second late. But the fire needed fuel, and without fire, nothing else mattered. He wrapped himself as completely as possible, checked that his face mask was secure, and stepped out into the wind-driven darkness of Oymakon's coldest hour. The village woodpile was a black shape against slightly less black darkness. He loaded his arms with split logs, moving with the mechanical efficiency of someone who'd done this twice already tonight, and knew exactly how much he could carry before his grip failed. The return trip was a nightmare of exhaustion and cold. His world had shrunk to the next step, then the next, then the next. The fire would seem to gain weight with each meter traveled. His shelter, only 300 meters away, might as well have been on another planet. But he made it. At 6:17 a.m., he stumbled back into his shelter and dropped the firewood with hands that barely functioned. He fed the fire with trembling fingers, building it back up to proper strength. The thermometer read minus 70.3 now. The temperature was finally, marginally, beginning to climb. The mountain man sat back down, wrapped in his reindeer fur, and allowed himself to acknowledge what he'd accomplished. He'd survived midnight. He'd survived the coldest hours. He'd survived 3 desperate fuel runs. He'd maintained fire through conditions that should have made it impossible. Dawn was coming. Not the sun yet. That was still hours away. But real twilight, the kind that would let him see his surroundings, that would signal the night's end. At 6:43 a.m., the eastern horizon shifted from black to deep blue. At 7 a.m., it showed the first hints of purple and orange. The mountain man fed his fire and waited for the sun. He'd made it through the coldest hours. The ordeal wasn't over, but the worst had passed. The night was releasing its grip. 7:43 in the morning. The sun still hadn't cleared the horizon, but the sky was alive with color now. Deep purples giving way to oranges and pinks that painted the frozen landscape in shades the mountain man had forgotten existed. After 11 hours of darkness punctuated only by firelight, the approaching dawn felt almost miraculous, as if light itself was a gift he'd never properly appreciated until now. The thermometer read -68.7. Still deadly. Still cold enough to kill an unprepared person in under 20 minutes. But compared to the -71.3 he'd endured at the night's peak, it felt almost temperate. His body, recalibrated by hours of extreme exposure, registered the 5-degree climb as genuine warmth. The mountain man sat by his fire, smaller now, since he no longer needed to fight the cold quite so desperately, and took inventory of the night's cost. His face, even behind the protection of the neoprene mask, had suffered. When he'd removed the mask at 7:15 to drink more hot water, he'd felt the damaged tissue, rough, hardened patches on both cheeks, across his nose, and along his forehead where the mask's edge had created a gap. Frostbite, 2nd degree at least, maybe worse. The skin would heal eventually, would slough off dead layers and regenerate, but it would leave marks. Scars that would map this night across his face for anyone who knew how to read them. His hands were in better shape than he'd feared. The 3 layers of gloves and the now exhausted chemical warmers had protected his fingers from permanent damage, though they were stiff and painful and would remain hypersensitive to cold for weeks. He'd kept them barely. His feet were the concerning unknown. They'd been numb for hours, and even now, as circulation slowly returned, he couldn't fully assess the damage. His toes felt distant, disconnected, as if they belonged to someone else. He'd need to remove his boots soon to check properly, but he was almost afraid to look. Frostbite damage to toes could mean anything from temporary numbness to permanent loss. But he was alive. That was the bottom line that mattered more than any individual injury. 11 hours ago, sitting in darkness at -71 degrees, with dwindling fuel and exhaustion setting in, survival had felt far from guaranteed. Now, with dawn breaking and temperatures climbing, he'd passed the threshold. The night had tested him and found him sufficient. At 8:02 a.m., the first edge of the sun touched the horizon. The mountain man watched it rise with an emotion he couldn't quite name. Not quite relief, not quite joy, but something deeper and more primal. Gratitude, maybe. Recognition that he existed in a universe where stars like that one provided the warmth that made life possible, and he'd survived long enough to see it return. The sunlight, when it reached him at 8:17 a.m., provided no measurable warmth. The angle was too low, the air too cold, the distance too great. But psychologically, it was transformative. Light meant visibility, meant an end to the claustrophobic darkness that had pressed in from all sides for 11 hours. He could see his shelter properly now. In the growing light, it looked even more inadequate than he'd remembered. 3 warped plywood walls, a rusted metal roof with gaps, packed snow for a floor. That this ramshackle structure had been his fortress against -71 degrees seemed almost absurd. And yet it had worked, when combined with fire and determination and the kind of constant vigilance that left no room for error. His fuel supply was nearly exhausted. The firewood that had seemed so abundant when he'd started now consisted of perhaps 8 or 9 small pieces. Enough for another hour, maybe 90 minutes. But he didn't need 90 minutes anymore. He needed to pack up, to make the walk back to the village proper, to find warmth and food, and begin the process of recovery. At 8:35 a.m., with the sun fully visible and the temperature climbing to -66.2, the mountain man began breaking camp. His movements were slow and clumsy, his body stiff from hours of minimal movement and extreme cold. Packing the reindeer for a sleeping roll required 3 attempts. His hands wouldn't cooperate, wouldn't grip properly, wouldn't execute the folding pattern his brain commanded. Eventually he managed it, securing the roll with cord that he had to tie using his teeth to supplement his unreliable fingers. He scattered the fire carefully, spreading the embers so they'd die naturally rather than smolder and potentially ignite something. He policed his area, making sure he'd left no trash, no evidence of his presence beyond the disturbed snow and the ash from his fire. The hunting shelter would remain here for the next person who needed it, unchanged by his occupancy. At 9:03 a.m., with his pack secured and his gear organized, he took one last look at the place that had sheltered him through the coldest night of his life. No part of him would miss it. Not the inadequate walls, not the bitter cold that had penetrated despite his fire, not the hours of darkness and isolation. But he felt something toward it nonetheless, a grudging respect, maybe, or acknowledgement of shared survival. The shelter had been enough, barely, and barely was all that mattered. The walk back to the village center took 45 minutes. His feet, damaged and numb, made walking treacherous. Several times he stumbled on terrain he should have navigated easily. His depth perception was off, his reaction time delayed, his body's feedback systems disrupted by the night's extreme stress. But he made steady progress, and by 9:48 a.m., he reached the outskirts of the village proper. The first person he encountered was an Oymyakon woman carrying water containers from her home to a neighbor's. She looked at him, really looked at him, taking in his frostbite-marked face, his stiff movements, his ice-crusted outer clothing, and said something in Russian he didn't understand. But her expression needed no translation. It said, "You actually did it. You survived out there, asterisk." She gestured toward a nearby house and called out. A younger man emerged, spoke briefly with her, then approached the mountain man. "You are the American who stayed outside last night," he said in accented but clear English. Not a question, a statement. "Yes," the mountain man replied, his voice hoarse from hours of breathing frozen air. "Come, my grandmother insists you have tea." The interior of the house hit him like a physical force, heat, overwhelming and disorienting after 11 hours in extreme cold. The temperature difference was easily 60 degrees, and his body didn't know how to process it. He felt dizzy, slightly nauseated, overwhelmed by the simple act of being warm. The grandmother, the woman who'd first spotted him, sat him near their stove and brought him tea. Real tea, hot and sweet, served in a ceramic cup that felt almost impossibly smooth and civilized after a night of aluminum pots and frozen equipment. He drank slowly, feeling the warmth spread through his chest. The family watched him with expressions that mixed curiosity, respect, and something that might have been amusement at the foolishness of foreigners. "Why?" the younger man finally asked. "Why do this?" The mountain man considered the question. He could explain about testing himself, about wanting to understand what the old-time trappers and hunters had endured, about the need to know if the stories he told himself about his capabilities were true. But all of that seemed insufficient somehow, too complex for the simple reality of what he'd done. "I wanted to know if I could," he said finally. The man translated for his grandmother. She replied in Russian, her tone matter-of-fact. "She says you are either very brave or very stupid, and she is not sure which." The mountain man smiled despite his damaged face. "Both, probably." The grandmother smiled back and poured him more tea. He stayed for 30 minutes, warming himself, letting his body adjust gradually rather than shocking it with too rapid a temperature change. They offered him food, bread and preserved fish, which he ate slowly, his stomach uncertain after hours of nothing but dried meat and nuts. When he finally prepared to leave, the grandmother said something else. The younger man translated. "She says the old hunters used to do this sometimes. Stay out alone. Test themselves. Most survived. Some did not. She says you have the look of someone who will not try it again." "She's probably right," the mountain man admitted. Outside, the temperature had climbed to -63.4. The village was coming alive now, people emerging from morning tasks, smoke rising from chimneys, the sounds of daily life resuming. To them, this was just another winter morning in Oymyakon. To him, it was proof that he'd survived something extraordinary. He walked slowly toward the village center, where he'd arranged for accommodation during his stay. His body ached in ways he'd never experienced. His face felt like leather stretched too tight. His feet sent shooting pains up his legs with each step. His hands trembled with exhaustion and cold damage. But he was walking. He was alive. He'd faced -71 degrees for 16 hours and emerged on the other side. The mountain man had always wanted to believe he was the kind of person who could not just survive extreme conditions, but thrive in them. Someone the old trappers would nod at with respect. Someone who understood cold not as an enemy, but as a force to be respected and coexisted with. Last night had stripped away the romanticism of that dream and shown him the brutal reality underneath. There had been no thriving, only grinding, relentless survival. No mastery, only desperate adaptation. No triumph over nature, only barely adequate preparation meeting impossible conditions and somehow, improbably, being enough. It had been harder than anything he'd imagined. Harder than his Alaska winters. Harder than his Yukon expeditions. Harder than any training or preparation could have truly readied him for. The cold at -71 wasn't just weather. It was an active, patient predator that waited for any mistake, any gap in vigilance, any moment of weakness. And he'd survived it. Not gracefully, not comfortably, but he'd survived it. That would have to be enough. The story of one night alone in Oymyakon at -71 degrees reminds us that survival at the edge of human endurance isn't about conquest or domination. It's about respect, preparation, and the stubborn refusal to quit when every rational calculation says you should. If stories like this speak to you, authentic frontier survival, extreme endurance, and the honest reality of testing yourself against nature's harshest conditions, then subscribe to the Old World Survival right now.